Hello and welcome to the Gary DeMar Show. I'm Joel McDurmon, sitting in for Gary DeMar once again. Today I'd like to talk about some news that is making a stir on the internet and of course on the news channels as well, and that is a bill proposed in the African nation of Uganda. The bill proposes to criminalize homosexuality, not just homosexual acts, but homosexuality, it appears, at least according to some reports. It also proposes, at least originally proposed, to impose the death penalty on those associated with the homosexual act. As you can imagine, liberals and human rights leaders across the world are decrying this piece of legislation. An article came out in Time magazine, says Uganda's anti-gay bill inspired by the U.S. And it goes on to condemn the conservative Christian culture in the United States, particularly the purpose-driven outreach of Rick Warren for inspiring the bill. Now, of course, there's more to this story. Rick Warren has come out and said, I had nothing to do with it, and I'll explain that in a minute. But there are a lot of issues involved here. Number one, the death penalty for homosexuality is mind-boggling at this stage in the world. Also, just the fact that evangelical leaders are gathering together on a moment's notice to join together and condemn this bill, all the while saying we shouldn't be involved in politics. Perhaps this is one of the most interesting things that came out of it to me. One of the chief ministers in Uganda who's behind this bill was at one time associated with Rick Warren's outreach, and so he, by association, seems to indicate that Rick Warren's so-called peace program and making Uganda a purpose-driven nation, overcoming AIDS and whatnot, seems to have some connection there. Now, obviously, like I said, Rick Warren has come out and said, no, I've long since broken associations with that man. I am calling all the Ugandan pastors to stand up and speak out about this bill. Now, this is what is so interesting to me. Whether you support the bill or not, is the positioning that the American evangelical pastors have in a foreign relations, an international law, or a law of a different nation anyway, stand that they're taking. Rick Warren says this: "It is not my personal calling as a pastor in America to comment or interfere in the political process of other nations." And of course, we've heard many, many times from Jim Wallace and others involved in the kind of liberal and neo-evangelical, quasi-evangelical world say, well, we shouldn't be involved in politics, we shouldn't mix Christianity and the state and things like that. Immediately before saying that line, Rick Warren, that we should not get involved in the political processes of other nations, he made a plea to all Ugandan pastors to stand up and speak out in opposition against this bill, which he calls unjust and unchristian. So there's this issue here to begin with of hypocrisy on the part of evangelical leaders who say we should not get involved in politics, we certainly shouldn't get involved in the politics of other nations. At the same time, they're calling the people of that nation to stand up and speak out against a particular piece of political legislation. Just a tad bit ironic, don't you think? Mr. Warren says that it is not his calling to get involved in foreign affairs, and yet in 2006 and times beyond that, he was invited by the Council on Foreign Relations, probably the biggest and most influential think tank in international politics and foreign policy in the United States, has tremendous power in the State Department and all through international banking and even the presidency. This multi-thousand member organization invited Rick Warren to speak at one of their New York conventions. Here is the Council on Foreign Relations' own publication on the affair from 2006, and it says, "A series of discussions focusing on the nexus of religion and foreign policy continued in its second year, featuring the Reverend Rick Warren, founding pastor of Saddleback Church." Apparently, he says it's not his job to get involved in international affairs, and then he goes, right after, I should say, he goes to speak at the Council on Foreign Relations on the subject of the intersection of religion and foreign affairs. I have a problem with someone who speaks out of both sides of their mouth like that. I have tremendous respect for the good that Mr. Warren has been able to accomplish. I've written critically of his movement and movements like it in the past. It should be found on the internet, my critiques on the purpose-driven movement. But I tremendously disrespect the hypocrisy involved in talking like this, wanting to have tremendous influence in international politics, all the while saying, I'm not called to be involved in international politics. It's a lie. Just come out and say that you believe Christians should be involved in politics. And the reason they won't do it is because then they have to start answering really tough questions. And that is, as a Christian involved in international politics, who says that your version of politics is biblical, is Christian? Well, Rick Warren has basically said that on this issue. He said this is an unchristian bill. Why does he say this? He lists 5 reasons, which I don't have all 5 in front of me, but I have 2 that are the most important. One is because it imposes the death penalty for homosexuality. And his answer to that is this: do you support the death penalty for homosexualities? Absolutely not. All life, no matter how humble or broken, whether unborn or dying, is precious to God. My wife Kay and I have devoted our lives and our ministry to saving the lives of people, including homosexuals, who are HIV positive. It would be inconsistent to save some lives and wish death on others. We're not just pro-life, we are whole life. Sounds like an insurance salesman to me, but is that a Christian argument? Is it consistent to say we oppose the death penalty, we oppose the criminalization of certain acts in the effort to be pro-life? Well, this has long since been a liberal argument against the death penalty across the board, and I don't know if Rick Warren holds that position, but certainly what he said here indicates that he does. Should we oppose the death penalty for mass murderers? Should we oppose the death penalty for rapists, multiple convicted rapists, for child molesters? You'll go down the line. They would have to say, no, we should not. Do you support life imprisonment for homosexuality? No, he does not. The other part of the bill that he mentions in passing is because it would force pastors who are counseling with homosexuals to break their confidentiality and report the homosexual as being involved in homosexual acts. And this, of course, would lead to their imprisonment or punishment or possibly death as well. What the Time article brings out is the fact that the Uganda bill would force anyone whose knowledge in any way party to the knowledge of someone else's homosexuality or homosexual act, they can be indicted as well. They can be punished for criminal acts as well, just for simply knowing and not reporting it. That seems to be passed by these people. The problem is not that the government is way overstepping its bounds in searching out, trying to find out knowledge and criminalizing people for what they know, for what they have in their heads and in their heart. No, these people are just upset because it's the death penalty, and they think we should be reaching out to people with HIV. I understand there are a lot of issues bound up in this that need to be talked about, and a lot more than I can talk about in 9.5 minutes. But the most important one is the death penalty for homosexuality is not one of them. Most disturbingly to me is Pastor Warren says that the biblical basis behind this is what he calls the greatest commandment, that is that we love our neighbors as ourselves. Number one, that's not the greatest commandment. Christ said that was the second greatest commandment. The greatest one is that we love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and body, and that means we're obedient to His law first before we pretend that we can love our neighbor. Because if we don't have that law first, we don't have a reference point for what love is. Secondly, that law to love your neighbor as yourself is not Jesus' law. It came directly from Leviticus 19. The exact same chapters, the exact same holiness code that condemns the homosexual act. Think about that. Thank you for joining me.